Greetings, Dooters, and welcome to the Dark Room. It's when we stand on the shoulders of giants that we can see the most distant shores. Ever since I was a young lad, hiding under the duvet with a flashlight and the latest copy of White Dwarf, I've always loved miniature art. Those old 90s dioramas and army shots in all their green-based glory really were inspiring to my younger self. So inspiring, in fact, that here I am, 30 years later, still sitting in a dark room, painting little men. There is something about coming across an artist who is miles ahead of you on the skill curve and just being blown away by their work. Most would look at these display level pieces and think, that's amazing, before getting on with their day. If, however, you're like me, a hobbyist with a propensity to daydream, there will always be the follow-up question, how? Today, we carry our white dwarfs with us in our pockets. They are constantly updated, and every opening offers some new miracle of miniature art. It could be a new technique or approach, a new aesthetic borrowed from some other art form and translated into the miniature realm, or even just an established technique refined to the point of witchcraft. Today, we are exposed to amazing images every minute of every day. This makes it all the more impressive when you encounter something that breaks through the noise and really grabs your imagination. For me, the artist that best encapsulates this currently is Elminiturista. Ever since I first encountered his work on this classic Blood Angels Sergeant a few years back, I've loved the way Elmini employs unusual techniques to create imaginative and bold special effects. Whether glowing, melting, scanning, or ricocheting, Elmini's work always has the power to surprise with another fresh idea. For a long time, I would feel intimidated when I saw an artist working at this level. Though I have had a few negative words for the box art approach on this channel previously, one thing you can say about it is that the techniques are at least accessible. Plenty of places offer guides and recipes, not least GW themselves. And while the heavy metal style has a very high skill ceiling, you can create perfectly serviceable paint jobs by following along the process to the best of your ability at the time. This changes when we go off the beaten track. When I first returned to 40k during 8th edition, I remember being stunned to see how far the field of miniature painting had progressed in the intervening 2 decades. While box art has been perfected with years of corporate polish, it was on the fringes that the real progress had been made. Techniques like object source lighting and non-metallic metal have elevated miniature painting. No longer just a part of the advertising process, painting Warhammer has become its own field of art, and I find that immensely exciting. There is something really compelling about looking at an artist's work and trying to work out how the magic happens. If something really grabs me, I can spend days mulling over posts and theory crafting how they are achieved. All the better if the artist posts parts of the process, as it gives you an invaluable peek over their shoulder. I don't quite know how it happened, but this channel is becoming something of a master's study. There is a certain way of thinking about recreating great work that I find very zen. I find myself daydreaming about it a lot. So, after using Craftworld Studios and White Paint's work as jumping off points from my previous videos, I thought it would be exciting to try out the Elminiturista technique and go for the glow. So, firstly, it would be remiss of me not to mention that Elminiturista does have a Patreon. We aren't going to be following his Patreon guide here, mainly because I wouldn't want to effectively leak his work by going through it on a free YouTube video. What we are going to do instead is to study some reference images and some of the reels that he's posted. We're going to be thinking about process and camera work, as this seems to be a very big part of this technique. And we're going to try and get into the mindset of study and analysis to piece together this process and hopefully get some similar results. Handily, this project has lined up nicely with the monthly painting challenge running on my Discord server of choice, the Orb. This month's theme is fire, so we're going to be going hard on the flames with some Legion of the Damned. The Orb is a great little server, and I encourage you to come and nerd out with us in the Painting General channel. With all that context out of the way, it's time to get to the painting table. So I'm going to be using the Terminator Captain from the Leviathan box set as a starting point for the conversion work. As I'm still a YouTube noob, I found the process of filming the conversion work damn near impossible, mainly due to the narrow field of view on my camera. Despite that, you can still see what I've done here. I found the same conversion kit used by Elminiturista after a quick search on Cults 3D. These parts come from Grey Tide Studio and have some incredible sculpts to add a flaming sword or screaming skull to any project. Link will be in the description. I printed off the parts on my GK2 printer with Sunlu dark grey resin. I printed lots of the generic flames and cut them up to glue along the hem of the cloak. I filled in any gaps with a 50-50 mix of Milliput and green stuff and sanded it off once dry. For the chef's kiss on this composition, I wanted our captain to have some kind of familiar. I've always loved Nurglings and think they add so much to a model, so I wanted something similar for our captain, maybe just to add a bit of humour to the piece. After all, contrast isn't just about colour. I found this little duder on Cults 3D. I was searching for some kind of skeleton and this just jumped out at me. The meme appeal is obvious, so let's give our captain a little skeleton hype man dooting the signal to charge. Once I was happy with the conversion work, I primed the model using some trusty Signal Black from Molotov. The darkroom has been recently upgraded with an FDM printer. Thanks, Mum. And I found these cool plinths on Bamboo Studio. The test print just happened to have a 50mm diameter top, so this was a perfect fit for the base. These plinths have gotten me thinking about busts, but that's a topic for another time. To begin the process, I base coat the whole model in Abaddon black. Although the model is already black, a base coat in Abaddon will allow us to make easy corrections later down the line, as I find that Molotov black is quite hard to thin accurately. I then pick out the flames with a light pass of white through the airbrush. I'm using an Iwata HP B+ with a 0.35 nozzle. My replacement 0.2 nozzle was delivered halfway through this project, and I do switch to it later for the armour. I'm just letting you know that you don't need a super fine nozzle to apply these targeted passes on the flames. We can see from Elminiturista that a little overspill is in fact desirable here, as this will act as the foundation for our glow. Once this is done, I throw some Mephiston red into the head cavity just to see how the white undercoat reacts on camera. I was feeling uninspired by this, so I went back to Elmini's videos and scrolled until I hit the secret sauce: fluorescent paints. Although he never outright states he uses fluoros in any of his reels, some of the yellows he uses have the telltale green hint that many fluoro yellow paints possess. It would make sense to use the brightest paints available when creating these glows, so it's going to be fluoro all the way for this fire. The core of this technique for painting fire is utilizing how fluorescent paints behave over white. Because fluorescent paints and inks are very transparent, they are very subtle when applied over dark colors. It's when you apply white first in targeted areas that the colors really start to sing. If you have some overspray from your glowing object, the black and white gradient will serve as a colorful glow. I've seen a lot of Elmini videos where he applies oils first to the OSL effects, but I haven't seen him do that for fire specifically, so we will hold off on that stage. I start blocking in all the flames in pure white. Even though I'm using 2 thin coats White Star, the best covering white paint I've ever used, I do still need 3 passes to get a nice solid white colour down. For the fluorescence, I'm going to start with some fluorescent orange ink from Darla Rowney. Instantly, we can see how this colour reacts with the white and black parts of the model. The white areas explode with colour, while the darker areas fade off into a dull, brooding glow. I give the flames 2 good passes with the orange, taking care to hit all the overspill so no white was left showing. To be honest, if you have a large army of flaming minis and you need to get them painted quickly, you could probably get away with doing just this. We are going big with this piece, however, so I move to layer on some yellow. I want to do this on the bottom half of the flames, as we want to sell the effect that the base of the flame is the hottest point. I really take my time with this step, trying to think about how the shapes of the flames are swirling and what parts would be hotter than others. It really helps to use images when thinking about this process. AI concept art is something I've found invaluable since Grok dropped on X, so it's well worth chatting with it if you are theory crafting a new project. You can even give it a reference image and ask it to recommend paints to you, quoting the Vallejo code numbers if you ask it to. Once I've got something I'm happy with, I go back in with some game colour fluoro paints from Vallejo. I mix a small amount of the orange into some yellow, about a 7:1 split, and tint all the white areas. You can't really see the difference on camera, but under the overhead light you can see how it lifts the flames to a more vibrant glow. Regarding cameras, it's important to realise that how you photograph or film this type of OSL plays a big part of the technique. Elminiturista has a few videos on taking photographs. We can see that he works with low brightness and exposure settings. He also tunes the white balance of the camera to the temperature of the lights in the environment. You can find these settings in the Pro mode of your phone's camera. I also like to bump my saturation, as I find this works well with a low exposure time on a dark background. Photography is one part of miniature art I think hobbyists overlook, but correctly setting up your cameras can lift a piece from the mundane to the magical. I'm planning a video explaining how I film my footage soon, so watch this space. To sell the effect of a flame cooling as it emanates from its source, I'll then add some crimson ink from Darla Rowney to the tips of the fire. As this ink is quite opaque, I feather it in while still wet with a clean, damp brush to get a nice gradient going. Once I'm happy with this, I go back in with some white. I identify the base of each flame and add a small dot to sell the hottest point. Note, this doesn't have to be the very bottom of the fire. Some have tall flames that wrap around each other, so I tend to place the white where I can see one flame becoming distinct from another. Again, take your time with this and get into the Zen mindset of fire crafting. It's very relaxing to let go of external worries and get lost in these complex shapes. You can see I also add some freehand fire to the inside of the cloak. I use the same process, but I just sketch the shapes in with white rather than allowing the sculptor to do the hard work for me. Now I'm happy with the flames, let's work up some reflections on the shiny black armour of our captain. To start, I'm going to be sketching out the values in Citadel Mephiston Red. I'm thinking about where the light would be hitting the surface and how the shape of the surface would shape the light it reflects. Elminiturista has a great exercise for practicing this kind of non-metallic metal technique. Hitting the underside edges of any surface above a flame is going to sell that glow as well. Once I have some values I'm happy with, I go back in with some white, tracing out the area where the light would be reflecting the strongest. Again, we're going to be using our secret sauce technique of fluorescent paint over white here. The trick is to get a very crispy edge on the white, followed by a slightly wider, untidier pass in fluorescent paint. We want to think about the light spilling over the surfaces, so don't be too neat when applying the colour. Once we have all our reflections worked up, the piece really starts to take shape. Onto the armour. As I've touched on in a previous video, when painting black, we should be careful never to paint a pure flat black if we want our piece to have contrast. I like to start with a dark blue-grey and work around that as a mid-tone. Citadel Dark Reaper is my go-to for black armour, but you can add any green or purple tints just as easily. I start by tentatively applying some hash lines to the tilt shields, but found this wasn't giving me the finish that I was after. My 0.2 nozzle had arrived at this point, so I break out the airbrush, remove the needle cap, and hold my breath for some very targeted value sketching in Dark Reaper. With this done, I dial back any overspray with a pass of thinned down Abaddon Black. We can already see on the tilt shields this is giving us a much nicer transition. From here, I slowly start to mix in some cold white from Vallejo, hitting my chosen reflection points in smaller and smaller areas. It's important to stress not to go overboard with this stage. We want the model to read as black, so keeping large areas of the recessed surfaces as pure black is what we need to do to sell the effect. To tie everything together, I do some bold edge highlighting in cold white, taking my time to get some crisp edges. Don't worry about highlighting every edge, just focus on those upward facing edges and those close to a reflection point. With a little time and patience, we have some great looking armour and flames. Onto the head. So, because this is such a small piece of the model, I found it quite hard to film in a way that would allow us to see all the details. I'm going to be playing around with the exposure and the lighting a little bit here to try and capture the process, so things may look a little different from shot to shot. I start off with a base coat in Tamiya flat white, then I give it a pass of Vallejo fluorescent orange. Once this is dry, I douse the head in a generous coat of fluorescent orange ink. Following the same theory of redder tones as we move away from the centre, I then overbrush the skull with some corn red until we have a nice rich tone. From here, I use some Eshin grey, darkened down with a little Abaddon black to mark out all the surface of the bone, taking care to allow a little of our glowing red to remain at the edges. To work up the colour, I started adding rack art flesh into my mix, progressing up to the bright point. Just like Elminiturista has done here, I'm not worrying too much about blending these colours together, as a sketchy look gives the feel of a rough pitted surface on the skull. We follow the same process as before for the flames, and soon we have a screaming skull worthy of any Nicolas Cage movie. Before I affix the head, I give the head cavity a pass in white, covering up our red from earlier, and then go over it with some fluorescent orange ink. It was at this point I wanted to get the model assembled before doing the finishing touches. I start painting the base. We are employing the same techniques here of layering white and fluorescent orange. However, after the first pass, I dry brushed the glowing edges in white to pick out the edges before tinting them with another pass of orange. If any areas go a bit overboard with the glow, I dial it back in with an airbrush pass of Abaddon Black, a few dots of Mitre Bond, and our captain is in situ, complete with flaming skull. For the tilt shields, I wanted to add some skull transfers. As these come off the sheet as a brilliant white, I want to tie them into the dark colour scheme with some airbrush glazing. This is a technique I've seen expertly applied by Sergio Calvo in several of his pieces. It's always amazed me how he has the courage to load up a cup of black paint and point it at hours and hours of work. Well, no risk, no reward, so let's give it a try. I fill my airbrush with an 80-20 split of flow improver and water, and then add a single drop of Abaddon Black into a roughly 1.5mm cup. Then, very carefully, and with no small amount of terror, I apply small dots of black to the bottom right of the shields, allowing the top of the skulls to remain bright white while the bottom halves disappear into the murk. Once I've got something I'm happy with, I use the remaining mix to further dial back some of the OSL on the base. Remember, for high contrast, we want large variations in small areas. Tell them, Elminiturista. From here, it's only really the bone and parchment to do. For the bone on the chest aquila, I apply the OSL edges to the undersides as before. I then layer the upward facing surfaces with some Escher grey and move up through rack art flesh just like on the skull. On the more complex shapes like the skull on the bolter, I found myself gently overbrushing rack art flesh, paying attention to the prominent edges. Little hacks like this can take a lot of the legwork out of layering complex shapes. Just make sure your paint isn't too dry, as this can create a chalky finish. There are a few details to pick out, but I'm careful not to go overboard as I want the focus to remain on our OSL work. Things like the bolts in the magazine and some of the purity seals I leave so they don't pull too much focus and overcomplicate the piece. With this complete, I do a final pass of edging in cold white and move on to the familiar. As this chap follows the same basic idea as the rest of the piece, I don't worry too much about filming it. It is simply white, followed by orange ink, a subtle overbrush with red, and then a healthy overbrush with rack art flesh, and our little Douter is done. The part I did spend some time on was placement. I feel this part of the composition was a little empty, so I used the familiar to fill it up and draw focus away from the bare shin plate of the captain. We want to give the skeleton a little OSL himself, so a few dots of white followed by some fluoro orange, and it's on to the glamour shots. They say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. After deep diving on Elminiturista's work for the past month or so, that is certainly a sentiment I agree with. It's one thing to follow a master's work and come up with similar results. It's quite another to come up with these incredible approaches yourself. Elminiturista's out-of-the-box thinking when it comes to miniature painting is constantly surprising us with another trick of artistic wizardry. And it's people like this that will always be pushing the art form forward, far beyond what can be contained on the front of a box. Although I feel like this piece came close to the master's work, I encourage you all to sign up to Elminiturista's Patreon to get the full rundown on the secret sauce for creating these luscious OSL effects. I'm sure there is plenty that I've missed out here, and of course, it's not just object source lighting that Elminiturista excels at, so go and support your local mini painting Jedi. If If you like what you've seen here today, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your thoughts on these techniques. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, X, and now Threads, where I've just hit 100 followers. I hope you all enjoyed your present over there. What I really wanted to show with this video is we don't have to be intimidated when we look at the work of great artists online. A little obsession, a little courage, and a lot of scrolling is all you really need to get into the mindset of dissecting these great approaches and giving them a try for yourself. That said, if you really love an artist and what they do, please don't forget to support them and keep the painting lights on for these incredible pioneers. Sometimes we can get a little down on ourselves if we're not producing paint jobs we're completely happy with. Comparing our work with others can lead to feelings of inadequacy and frustration. I know, I've been there. If you find yourself doing this, I encourage you to pick an artist you love and dive into their material with both feet, no matter how far behind them you may feel you are. You will always learn something, and you may just have a lot of fun as well. Thank you, Duters, and I'll see you next time in the dark room.